Thank you very much. I also want to echo the sentiments of the other American invitees in thanking Professor Zhang and the conference sponsors for inviting us. It's been a wonderful experience, and I also want to comment on the 40 years of environmental protection. 40 years ago, I was a young environmental scientist engineer, and my first assignment was, because the Clean Air Act had passed in 1970, was to be part of the technical team writing the air pollution control plan for Los Angeles. And as we all know, Los Angeles is the smog capital of the world. And after a couple of years, I thought this is an impossible assignment. So I had an opportunity to move up to the San Francisco Bay Area, where I spent a little more than 30 years continuing to write air quality plans and to see them implemented. And so with about 40 years of experience in air quality controls in California, I thought perhaps I could share some of those thoughts. In 2005, I had an opportunity to take early retirement, and shortly thereafter started coming here to Beijing and affiliated with Beida, and had opportunity since then to do some part-time teaching and to share some ideas. And it's really in that vein that as I went back and forth from San Francisco to Beijing, I thought to myself, what a wonderful comparison between two cities. So as we think about the 40 years of environmental protection, I'd like to share a 40-year tale of two polluted cities. And it's hard to talk about a tale of two cities without going to Charles Dickens. And back then in the 19th century, Charles Dickens commented that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going directly to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. So with that, let me make some comparisons between Beijing and the San Francisco Bay Area, and perhaps some lessons learned that we have gained over the past 40 years that may be instructive to the roadmap or the blueprint that Beijing needs to solve the air pollution problems, and in particular, the PM 2.5 problems that are so serious in this region. Very quickly, by the way, I really appreciate the previous two speakers, because since they've dealt with the science and the engineering and the technical aspects, I can put on a policy and a management hat. And so that's really what this presentation is going to be much more about. So if you look at San Francisco and Beijing, both of them are wonderful metropolitan areas. And in the Bay Area, we have a little more than 7 million people. Of course, here in Beijing, we have 20 million. But even with 7 million people, we have more cars than you do. And the regional GDP in the San Francisco Bay Area is very strong, much higher than most of the other regions, and certainly higher than an average for the United States. So again, the San Francisco Bay Area is very, very concerned about having a strong economy. If you look at the San Francisco GDP and you look at the foundations of it, you'll see companies that are household words: Google, Apple, Yahoo, a lot of the influence from Stanford University, Hewlett-Packard, another Stanford, Maxtor, Chevron, Oil, Intel. So all of these are international powerhouses, and so it tells you that San Francisco wants and desires to have a strong economy. Okay, the economy is extremely important. But on the other hand, we're also very concerned about our environment. And so if you look at it, there's a lot of similarities. Here in Beijing, we have mountains in the north and on the western side. Actually, much of the Bay Area, if you take out the bay, is a little surrounded by mountains, and we actually have almost like a valley. So the air pollution comes in off of the ocean and then heads south down towards San Jose. And in the 50s and 60s, the air pollution in San Francisco was very polluted. If you look at the land areas, San Francisco Bay Area is about 18,000 square kilometers. The Bay Area, Beijing, is about 16,800. So again, very, very similar. Back then, in the late 50s and 60s, before there were any air pollution control regulations, we had open burning. So whether it would be the farmers or commercial or industrial things, you could just burn freely. And this is what really led, or was a tipping point for the development of air pollution control regulations. If you come there today, we have blue skies virtually every day. I wish all of you could come and see and witness this. Here in Beijing, it's been a little bit of the opposite. Obviously, 30, 40 years ago, as the economy got stronger and stronger, we have moved from clean air to the situation that we saw here this last winter. So the question is, why? What happened in the San Francisco Bay Area? And then what can we do? And so hopefully my comments, to the extent that they're applicable and that they're useful in a policy and a management standpoint, I offer them to you. They have worked in not only San Francisco, but many areas of the United States. The key is emissions. The previous speakers have talked about emissions of VOCs and NOx. In California, the most serious problems have been ozone, historically. So right after the Clean Air Act passed in 1970, we focused on reducing volatile organic compounds and NOx. It turns out with 25 years or 30 years of focusing on this, it gave us a head start on PM. Back then in 1970, the standard was total suspended particulates, and then more recently it became PM10, and then only in the last decade has it been PM 2.5. But by spending decades trying to reduce ozone aggressively, we have had a head start on solving the PM 2.5, and that was noted that it has to be a multi-pollutant strategy if you really want to deal with this. To give you a sense of the types of emissions, and I'm going to use very simple numbers, but if you go back and extrapolate the emissions of VOCs to about late 1960s, we had close to 2,000 tons per day. And so we have gone from about 2,000 tons per day to today, where you're hovering around a little over 200. We are talking about 80 to 90% control of VOCs. 80 to 90%. When I read in the media here about some of the estimates of what we can do in 5 years, and that will solve or make a significant dent, don't believe it. The math does not work. It will take 80 to 90% control. And that's if you assume a linear model, and it's already been pointed out that this is a very non-linear process because of secondary aerosols, secondary reactions. The same thing in terms of NOx. Over the last 40 years, we have probably controlled 65 to 70% of the NOx emissions. And the NOx, both directly and as secondary aerosols, also contribute significantly to not only ozone, but also to PM 2.5. Now, if you look at the result, reducing emissions improves air quality. It's very simple. It may not reduce it linearly, but certainly if you reduce enough of the emissions, your air quality will improve. Here you see basically data from 1968 to 2006, and basically it's back in 1968, what we would call, or you call, your smog days or haze days, we had about 100. So we have gone from about 100 smog days down to a couple. Every year now, maybe 2 or 3. Okay, so reducing 90% of the hydrocarbon emissions, 60 to 70% of it, will get you significant improvements in ozone. Now you notice that the data is very, very noisy. That is meteorology. Okay, you can go very, very high one year, 90 to 100, violations of the standard or smog days. And then in 2 years, you could be down to 30 or 40. It's weather, it's meteorology. It's a dominant factor in terms of your controls. So you have to continually reduce the emissions and just hope for good weather. I was here during the 2008 Olympics. I did some exercises with my classes, and I asked them to write, as part of their writing, a strategy for clean air during the Olympics. And after all of the papers, I told them, I said, you know what is the most important thing for the air to be clean during the Olympics? I said, pray for good weather. And fortunately, there was relatively good weather, and so everybody talked about what a wonderful program. Weather overwhelms the emissions. Okay, you can have relatively same emissions under different atmospheric meteorological conditions, both for ozone and for PM 2.5, and you'll get vastly different results. We've already talked about different standards. You need standards. Again, the PM 2.5 standard in America has only been in place for about a dozen years, but again, you still notice the variability of the standard, and that's due to meteorology. Okay, so even though emissions may be relatively constant, you get large fluctuations, but because, again, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had aggressive programs for ozone, our PM 2.5 problem became much less serious. And we've been able to continue to ride that wave. Now, I'll be leaving soon after having spent 2 months here, and I really don't want to be in Beijing when the heating season starts. And this is why. Because, again, meteorology and atmospheric things, most of your ozone problem is during the summer when it's very, very hot, and most of your particulate problem is going to be during the winter season, and it's exacerbated by the fact that you've got heating during that period of time. So again, this is our experience even without special heating. Let me talk about this roadmap of what happened in not only California, but throughout the country. The pivotal act was the 1970 Clean Air Act. Now, subsequently, it was revised in 70 and 90 and so forth. But a few principles were laid out here that were very, very important for America to be able to make the success that it's in. First of all, the air quality standards are based on health effects. And that was pointed out very, very well in the previous speech in terms of the mortality, morbidity, all of the various effects. In America and hopefully around the world, the United Nations, WHO and so forth, everybody has the right to breathe clean air. Okay, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're in an urban environment, rural environment, health effects determine what the standards are. So everybody here in China, we have health-based standards. In America, that drives it. Secondly, we have plans required in the Clean Air Act. And these state implementation plans are required to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. This is a difference between China and US. Here we have plans and we have standards, but there's no linkage between them. In America, when you write a plan, and that's what I was doing in the beginning of my career, I was writing the plan to show how the standard would be met. In other words, you required to show this plan will meet this standard. Beyond that, there were deadlines. Okay, that's the other thing that we don't have. Here in China, we have goals, we have action plans, we have different proposals, but in America, it's linked. You have to have a standard, you have to have a plan to meet the standard, and you have to have a deadline to meet that standard. And then last of all, which is really the most powerful thing, we talked about a little bit yesterday in terms of public participation, the Clean Air Act put in a provision that allowed for citizen lawsuits. Now, there was some mention made yesterday about lawsuits that, yes, we now are able to pursue the polluter, so we can sue. This is a citizen lawsuit that sues the government. The citizen can sue the government. I was working as a contractor for the Environmental Protection Agency when we were sued by a citizen that now is very active in the California Air Resources Board under this provision. This makes it extremely powerful. If the government is not doing its job by preparing the plan to meet the standards by the deadline, any citizen can sue the government. And that has been a motivating force for driving many of these programs in America. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly and quickly. In my paper, I detail a lot of this quite a bit more, but let's talk about roughly what happened during each decade. So during the decades, we did a lot of what seems to be taking place here in China, which is you go after big sources. So you look after large industrial sources, and then you set standards for the cars. So the first catalyst to clean up the cars and reduce the automotive pollution by 90% took place in the 1970s, and the new cars started coming out in 1975. Okay, we started doing more monitoring, more modeling, improving our emission inventories and so forth, but it's very cursory. When we look back at it now, it's not very significant or important. Here, you're probably reducing or controlling hundreds of sources. Okay, you're reducing pollution from big sources, very identifiable, and whether it be a power plant or whether it be a chemical factory, whatever, the big obvious sources that everybody knows about. During the 80s, we continued to control. Now you're going to notice a theme as you go from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s. You go from fewer to many, and you go from direct regulation to more economic incentives. Okay, so now we were controlling industry, but we were including now medium-sized industries. So all of the large industries had some control technology, and now we started going after smaller sources. And then we started tightening the motor vehicle standards. I've been coming here for about 7 years at Beida, and Euro 4 standards are still in place. Euro 4 standards will not get the job done. You have to have much cleaner cars. We have been pushing in California and continue to push to have the cleanest cars in the world. If Beijing and China wants to get serious about air pollution, you need the cleanest cars in the world. Follow not the Euro standards, but follow California. It's more expensive, but that will make significant contributions. Then you have to start also looking at more than cars. You've got trucks and buses and diesels and motorcycles, and also annual inspection and maintenance programs. Every year my cars have to go in for an inspection to make sure that the emission control equipment is still working properly. Because when the emission control equipment doesn't start working, it can basically pollute like 50 cars. And then we started beginning to look at small sources. Now here in the newspaper, sometimes the citizen says, oh, it's ridiculous, you're trying to control the barbecues and so on and so forth. Well, we did that in California, but you do it sequentially over time. You don't do it right away. It's not a big source, but it is a significant source because you have so many of them. What do we do in the 90s? 90s, we continued to expand on medium sources. We started developing new technologies for even small sources like VOCs for paints. You do not have volatile organic compounds in the paints in California. Now it's almost all water-based. We started pushing control technologies on cars even more. We started now having low emission vehicles and ultra low emission vehicles. And now we started working on cleaner fuels. As you get cleaner and cleaner cars, the fuels that you have, the gasoline, the diesel and so forth, the fuels themselves have to become much cleaner. So we have ultra low sulfur diesel fuel. We have much cleaner gasoline that is in the car. The gasoline that is now sold in the cars is significantly cleaner than the gas that was sold 10, 15 years ago. Now we started looking at small engines. We have a lot of equipment that we use for gardening and so forth. Even the small engines, if they have a motor and they use gasoline, we need to control those. In 2000, we continued this. And we've now gone back to the big sources. We put more controls on them, emission standards for off-road vehicles like construction, and for motor vehicles. Now we've gone from low and ultra-low emission vehicles to zero emission vehicles. California is making a big push for electric cars, natural gas cars, something that will emit zero. And you've gone to best management practices, intermittent controls, trying to predict when the air pollution is going to be very severe, and then educating the public to be part of the problem, not to paint, not to have barbecue. All of those things are on a voluntary basis. So what are the lessons that have been learned? The previous two speakers should have already made this point. The air pollution problems are really complicated. Okay, so you need good science, you need good engineering. The work that's being done here at Beida is actually superb. It's very, very good, but that has to be the foundation of any good air quality plan, is good, solid information. Secondly, you need comprehensive, long-term solutions. What I read in the paper here is, in the next 5-year plan, we will make this and it will solve or significantly solve it. Or in the next, it is not going to be solved in the next 5-year plan. It is not going to be solved in the next 2 5-year plans or the next 3 5-year plans. It's going to take decades, not years, to solve these types of problems. These problems have taken decades to form. It will take decades to solve. Comprehensive monitoring, meteorological emission inventory data. This sounds very simple. It is not. These emission inventory data are very complicated. It takes teams to compile them. As the emissions come further and further down, the natural sources of emission from trees, from farming activity and everything else become much more significant and much more, we do not understand these fully. The computer modeling, we've used it extensively in the Bay Area to do ozone control strategies, testing what will work and what won't, what's the most cost effective. It's a good tool, okay? Comprehensive strategies are needed for all possible sources. Most of what I read in the media here is the obvious sources. You need to control big sources, medium sources, small sources, okay? The big sources are in the hundreds and the thousands. Medium sources may be in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The small sources could be in the millions, okay? And we need to educate the public. In California, we have spent lots and lots of money telling people that they are part of the problem, okay? That they need to be part of the solution. It's so easy to point your finger at that's the problem, and not realize that we all are part of this particular problem. Priority has to be given to the most cost-effective measures. That's what will sell it, especially on industrial controls. A lot of these controls will use new control technologies. Sometimes they'll use what are called best management practice. For example, the new street sweeping equipment where you use motorized trucks that spray the street, that's a best management practice. We need a lot of those types of programs all over the city in many, many categories and many types of small businesses to improve it. Regulatory and incentive approaches are needed. Interestingly, 6 months ago when I was here, I read in the China Daily, Premier Li Keqiang had an article where, because of the severity of the air pollution problem here in Beijing, he says, we will control the Beijing air pollution problem with an iron fist. You can use an iron fist with large industrial sources. You cannot use an iron fist with 5 million car owners. In America, we have an iron fist, but we also have a silk glove. You need both. You need the regulatory approaches, but for the smaller sources, you need incentive approaches. On vehicles, we need cars, trucks, buses, trains, planes, motorcycles. We need to have much tighter controls on the fuel content. It's not just coal. You need cleaner gasoline, you need cleaner diesel. In-use vehicle inspection maintenance, I talked about that. Land use planning, that's important. Increase widespread public education. We have extensive media publication in radio, television, internet, and so forth, especially for intermittent control when we educate the public not to drive because of high smog potential. Two final thoughts. A lot of times when I'm in other countries talking about air pollution and other things, they say, oh, the reason you do that in America is you're rich. You have money, you can do that. And you have the luxury of spending on air pollution control. This is not true. This is not the reason that we spend so much money on air pollution control. It's already been pointed out, and America has done many studies. We can debate, the numbers, the statistical value, death, and everything else. But all of our studies show that the reason we invest heavily on air pollution is because the benefits far outweigh the costs. Okay. My last point is I began with a story about where I was 40 years ago. I want to end with a story about where I was 40 years ago. About 40 years ago, I was taking an environmental law class. And I had a professor that was wise and old and had been studying environmental controls in America since the 50s and 60s. And basically, he told me something in the class that I remember to this day. And as I tracked my career in environmental protection, I found it to be very true. And what this professor said was the following. Oh, I want to talk about clean air and a strong economy are positive. That's one of the points. But the last point is, this professor said that the lesson of American environmentalism is that in trying to achieve too much too fast, we get too little too late. Okay? And I have seen that repeatedly in that when the problem becomes very severe, we want to do something now. I want something quick. I want something easy. I want something cheap. It is not going to be cheap. It is not going to be easy. And it's not going to be quick. Okay? So hopefully we can be wise. We can be deliberate. We can be aggressive, steadfast, and hopefully we get it right. Do not promise too much and deliver too little. Thank you very much.